Today seems like the perfect day to flip through the very first Pleasant Company catalog to ever exist. This catalog is from when Molly, Samantha, and Kirsten were the only dolls available. That means all of the images were styled and shot before the company even launched in September of 1986. I have spent years collecting and studying early Pleasant Company, especially from 1986, so we're going to go through every single spread, every single page, every single item, and I'm going to tell you everything that I know with maybe a few assumptions. We're going to see truly why this company has captured the hearts of so many people. So cozy up and maybe grab a drink. We are going to flip through the very first Pleasant Company catalog from 1986. What a gorgeous sight that we have in front of us right now. This is the original Pleasant Company catalog design from 1986. Technically, this is a 1987 issue. This was the second, well, this catalog specifically that we're looking at right here was the second printing of them because of one little thing we'll see when we flip the page. But other than the copyright date on the actual catalog, everything else is exactly the same as the 1986 version. So this really is a treat today to be able to look at this up close, and I'm going to tell you everything I know about it. So we're going to start with the cover. One of the I think the most interesting thing about this cover, I actually learned a couple of years ago in a Facebook group. This child model is obviously a full grown adult now, and she actually joined a couple of the Facebook groups back when like sort of Pleasant Company and American Girl had like this resurgence in popularity because of the pandemic. So the Facebook groups were really popping off, and she ended up joining a few of them and told her story about being a cover model, which I'll give you a couple of the quick takeaways. And I think the most interesting thing that I learned from it was that she was actually the one that got to select which doll was in the photograph with her. So it wasn't up to Pleasant Rowland or anybody else. It was this young little girl right here that walked on set that day and said, I choose Molly. And that's why Molly is on the cover of the very first Pleasant Company catalog, which, I mean, please, anybody with this iconic of a haircut deserves whatever they want. So they made the right call. This catalog cover to me is so quintessentially 80s and honestly like 90s as well. I mean, we have like this beautiful set. I mean, you know that the home that they shot this in was a good home, like a very, very nice home, especially at the time. As we see all of this beautiful like picture frame molding, these nice deep windowsills and the muntins on the windows. I'm just going to assume that this was shot in somebody's home and not on an actual set, even though I don't know for sure. But I mean, again, this looks like Martha Stewart's home. But yeah, a really, really, really cozy looking cover. And as I said, we have the original Molly McIntyre on there. One interesting story that the woman who was once upon a time this little girl said when she was telling her story about being the cover model is she said that she actually didn't get to keep the doll, which I thought is very interesting, but you know, honestly, probably not that uncommon. I don't know if even the child models of today that work for American Girl get to keep the doll that they model with, but I would assume at least in 1986, the reason she didn't get to keep the doll was probably because it was a prototype. Because you got to remember, the company had not launched at this point. This was the very first catalog that went out. So all of these product photos were being taken, presumably, like, if I had to guess, probably somewhere around the spring of 1986, maybe a little bit later. It just depends on when all of the prototypes and stock was showing up, you know. So I would assume that this was shot months and months before the launch of the company. So there's a good chance that they didn't have stock of these dolls on hand when they shot all of these photos. So it's kind of my theory that most of what we're going to see in this catalog today are prototypes. And so, that's my guess as to the reason that she didn't get to keep the doll, is it was probably one of like 3 Molly dolls that were in hand at the time, but who knows. So yeah, that's why we see Molly on the cover, is this young little girl right here decided that was her favorite doll, and that's why Molly's on the cover. I have to say, I would really love one of these. I think this is a couch or maybe a day bed. I'm not sure. But to me, this looks like a couch based on like the piping and everything. But this is so like Golden Girls, like iconically 80s. I kind of like want this stuff to come back into fashion because it's just so warm and inviting. Like just to like find a sunbeam on like in a room like this, curled up with your doll reading a book. I mean, what screams childhood more than that. That is so, so beautiful. I just absolutely love this cover, and clearly Pleasant Company did as well, because they actually used this for a few pressings. We had one from 1986, one from 1987, which is the one we're looking at, which is identical to the 86 one, and then they did it again in the very early 90s. In fact, I actually have one right here that I can show you. This was from summer of 1992. They used the same exact photo, but you can see here, this was by the time they had actually launched the new Baby collection, which ultimately became Bitty Baby. So yeah, they used it about 3 times. Well, actually, no. I want to say they probably used it for about 4 pressings. Again, we may look at some of these versions in another video, but even down to when they introduced like the birthday collections, this cover was used for a good year, and then again in the 90s, presumably because maybe they didn't get the cover shot in time for the 92 catalog. Who knows? But anyway, this, in my opinion, is probably the most iconic catalog cover of all time. Oh yeah, and even down to Courtney Moore's collection actually including a miniature version of it from when Courtney got the catalog and the story. So this is actually part of Courtney's collection, a roughly 1/3 scale. You can see they cheated a little bit. This is a little bit smaller than 1/3 scale, but this is Courtney's Pleasant Company catalog, which we're going to see the real version, so I'm not going to give too many spoilers in here, although I would imagine if you're watching this video, you've probably seen these images quite a few times at this point. So let's go ahead and tear into them, and I can start telling you everything I know and assume about this catalog. So right off the bat, we can tell that this is an original catalog because the only Pleasant Company dolls and characters that existed in early 1987 are Kirsten, Samantha, and Molly. And obviously I'm going to film this in a way that I think makes it a little bit easier to pause and read if you really just want to stop and like soak in every little piece of information in these catalogs, because it really is, I think, for so many of us, a trip down memory lane where we can just really remember exactly what it was like to flip through these things and just dream and ponder what it would be like to eventually own one of these dolls that we've been reading about their stories in these books for many of us, like weeks and months, and in my case years, and never getting the doll. But you know, there is something nostalgic about hope as well. So what's really interesting in these early catalogs is they really do have a lot more real estate to just sort of spread out and tell us things. I mean, by now, you know, American Girl has like dozens and dozens of dolls in their line. So they, you know, if they're sending out a catalog, they only have so much real estate to, you know, tell us about Truly Me number 127. So here, when we only had 3 characters, I mean, we literally got an entire page for Meet Kirsten before we have even seen a doll yet. Like, we just see the cover of Meet Kirsten, an American Girl, one of the most iconic books of all time, in my opinion. And you know, again, a full page just for a book, which is so insane these days. I feel like it's so impossible to sell books to children now. But we have a full description of who Kirsten is and what her story is like. And we have, obviously, in this catalog, this is going to be a running theme, obviously, is we have prices and product codes and a lot of information really that ultimately helps tell us about the history of when things were released and what goes with what. Catalogs have been a really important part of helping me figure out what was released when and what was changed when. These are really sort of our key to the past with early Pleasant Company, because we didn't have the internet in 1986, at least not commonly in households. It would be a decade later before we saw the internet to start to be more common in households. So all of the information, for the most part, that we find is dug up in physical media like this. So this is why I love having these catalogs, and I have such a huge catalog collection, because there's such a wealth of knowledge in it. But it's also like really fun to not only see like the versions of things that were available, like you could see here in 1987, you could order an audio cassette of Meet Kirsten and any of the books that were available at the time, which each character only had 3 books at the time because there were only 3 stories at the launch. So you had the option of ordering in a hardcover, a paperback, or an audio cassette. And I want to say they ran these for a couple of years and then they discontinued them. They can be a little bit difficult to find, but I have a handful of them in my collection, and I ultimately want to try and complete my collection of audio cassette tapes. But this is crazy to me to see like how expensive books used to be. Like a hardback version of Meet Kirsten was $12.95, and I'm not going to go through and do like exact calculations of what it would be to the like the penny what this is in today's money, but as a general rule, I feel like it's at least double what it was in 1986. So we're talking like $25 at least for a book, which is so insane to think about now. But you know, we won't get into the politics of all of that. But just very, very interesting. It's and again, we have like a toll-free number, like their 800 number, which might actually still be their number today. I called this number the other day, I feel like, because I had a support issue with one of my orders, and I think this is still their phone number if I recall correctly. And then we have like a local Wisconsin line, obviously, because this is toll-free though, so I don't. It's interesting that they have a Wisconsin line. I don't know. Normally, you think that's just so that they don't have to pay long-distance charges because that was a thing in the 80s. All right. Again, another like I'm gonna say the word iconic like 1,000 times in this video, but it really is worth stating that this catalog is completely iconic, and I think mainly because they reused so many of these images for years and years and years. I can't remember the exact date, but I mean we're talking like well into the 90s. They were still using these original images that they had of the very first dolls. So here we have like a full. These are to scale, by the way. These like full spreads showing the doll like head to toe were basically intended to show the scale of these dolls. And we had all different types of scales of dolls in the 80s, so it wasn't like it was particularly revolutionary at the time to have an 18-inch doll at this scale. But I do feel like this was at a time when toys were starting to get a little bit more mass produced and cheaply made. So when we think about things like Barbie, for instance, I think this was a little bit before Polly Pocket, but a lot of the dolls that were starting to be made around this time, you can really see a big difference in the quality in them. And I think one of the big purposes of this was to show not only how big the dolls were, but you can really go in and see all of the details. Like you can go in here and see, like, even just on this eyeball, you can see the details of what we now call a pinwheel eye. Just like how much detail is in these dolls compared to the average doll that you would go get at Walmart or Kmart or KB Toys or wherever. And this was really important because you couldn't go in stores and see these dolls in person. These were catalog order only. And in my personal opinion, this is just me guessing based on my knowledge having been in an industry involving retail and wholesale and all of those things. I think the reason that these were not in stores was because they could not afford to sell these at wholesale, because these dolls were made in West Germany by a company called Goetz, and they were a high-end doll company, and they made both playline and collectible dolls. But at the end of the day, all of their dolls were actually quite expensive, and it was very expensive for Pleasant Rowland to have these made, not only to just have them conceived, but to actually produce them as well. I mean, you see all of these details in their outfits and the make of them. The dolls are wigged, so just basically no expenses spared in making these things. So originally the retail cost for just oh, that's the collector version. So the original Kirsten doll with, let's say, the cheapest version you could get of Kirsten was with a paperback book. They eventually started selling them without books, but I think in the beginning you had to get a book with them. So the original paperback version of Kirsten sold for $68, which one thing that we talk about a lot on this channel is inflation and price increases, because it's a really important thing for a doll collector to pay attention to what things are costing you. We all have to budget for these things, but again, if we're just doing the rough math of doubling, this is what, like $136. Don't judge me on my math. That is actually cheaper than they are charging for historical dolls today, which now I think the historical dolls, if you want to buy Kirsten, who was recently re-released, she is $125. So that's sort of like, later on, they obviously moved production to China, which was a huge cost savings. And there have been some things that they have done to kind of cut costs in the production of these dolls. But I think they have done an exceptional job of keeping prices, when you consider inflation, keeping these dolls as affordable as they were back in the day, which again is not incredibly affordable, but this is a high-end brand. This is a luxury doll brand, and children weren't expected to get one of these every month. You were a very lucky child if you got one in the first place. And even then, most of the kids that got these didn't get a lot of the extra outfits or get multiple dolls. So this really was meant to be a special purchase for a child. So again, you can see all of the details in here. Again, I think this is why these images are so big in here. It was not only to show scale, but just to show, like, we have like an actual necklace with multiple pieces, and it has a clasp. We have this collar, we have an extra bonnet, all the hair ribbons, even down to these bloomers that kind of peek out underneath her, like her little pioneer dress. We've got this spoon bag with her spoon. Again, I believe these were likely prototypes, because we see some things that aren't as common, even with like 1986 dolls. Like, this doll's hair looks shorter to me than the average Kirsten doll, even from 1986. So again, I think this is something that they probably spec'd out and lengthened by the time these dolls went into production. But other than that, pretty much everything we see here are things that we see in 1986 dolls, including the very coveted chipped teeth, is what we ultimately ended up calling them. But they're the version of the original teeth that were hand painted, and they have all different types of qualities to them because they were hand painted by the artisans at the Goetz factory, but they're often very rounded. They will have paint spanning over the gap in the teeth, and a lot of times they often look smaller, especially when you compare them to the larger teeth they started making in 1987. But this is a true original looking Kirsten doll, and the closer you can find one that looks exactly like this, the more money you're going to pay for them. Believe me, I have spent thousands of dollars on my Pleasant Company collection, and dolls like this are, while not impossible to find, they are just very expensive because more people want them than there are ones available. So keep that in mind if you're wanting to collect early Pleasant Company. You are going to get in an absolute eyeball scratching out fight to get one of these dolls. But absolutely incredible. Like, and that's why I like collecting the most original dolls. As I said before, like, they reuse these images for years and years and years. So I tend to pinpoint my like peak Pleasant Company desire age, or let's say year, was 1991. That's really where I kind of feel like I remember seeing the dolls for the first time, because I remember Felicity being new, but I also remember Addie getting released. So I think it's very, very early 90s. But in a 1991 catalog, they used this exact image to show Kirsten. So this is the exact photograph that they used, pretty much down to the same background and everything. They didn't even like crop it out. Like, this is the exact picture I remember seeing when I was, 6 years old, desperate for one of these dolls. This is the version of Kirsten that I and so many millennials and even Gen Xers know of Kirsten. So that's why when I collect, I'm trying to buy stuff that is like basically from my childhood. So while it can make sense to buy things from 1991, they are different looking in many cases than what was released in 1986. So I want the ones that look like the catalog from 1991, which interestingly is the stuff that was produced basically before the dolls were even released in September of 1986. So, and there's just all these like subtle differences. Again, we have the chipped teeth, these really short up curled eyelashes, the thick fabric on her bonnet, a lot of little idiosyncrasies. But again, like, we have a spoon bag with no stitching, like reinforced stitching on the edges here. This is something that a few of the early dolls had as well, although some of them are actually stitched. Again, I think it just depended on who made them. But yeah, a very, very early version of Kirsten. And one thing before we move on to the next spread is, you can see here where it says doll collectors. This is basically where you could originally purchase a signed version of this doll, which are some of the most coveted versions of the early Pleasant Company dolls, are the ones that are signed and numbered by Pleasant Rowland. And believe it or not, back in the day, you could order one for $95, which is absolutely crazy to think about now, because especially if you were one of the first people to order these, the doll in mint condition with an early signature is worth thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So really, 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 really coveted. But it just does sting a little bit when you go back and look at these catalogs to think, like, The cheapest version of Kirsten was $68, but for like not even $30 more, you could have a doll that like ultimately rose a ton in value. But at the end of the day, I don't care so much about the value as I do just having these original rare items. So yeah, it's cost me quite a pretty penny to get some of the signed dolls that I have, but yeah, like I said, it does sting a little bit to see that at one point they were sold for $95. So here we have, I think, one of the most iconic spreads in this entire catalog. Again, each of these girls didn't have a ton of spreads in the beginning. This is basically Kirsten's main story spreads that we're going to see in this catalog. So the original structure was they only had 3 books. They had we'll just take Kirsten as an example, but they did the same thing for both Molly and Samantha as well. So they had Meet Kirsten, which was the book that we got with the doll and her original meet outfit that tells like her origin story, basically. And then we have Kirsten's school story, which would be paired with Kirsten learns a lesson in the book structure. So and then we have the third one that is Kirsten's Christmas story, which is Kirsten's surprise. So we'll jump over to Kirsten's school story first, because if you didn't know, Pleasant Rowland actually started out as a teacher before she got into publishing and then ultimately doll manufacturing and taking over the world with these dolls. But I should say country more than world. This is American Girl really isn't that much of a worldwide phenomenon. But it's like almost cult like in America. But so Kirsten's school story is first, and I feel like Pleasant probably prioritized these things because, you know, these dolls ultimately she wanted to educate, well, in her words, like educate young girls about history and what it was like to be a young girl at different points in history. And I think because of her education background, she prioritized the school story above the other one. So that's why it's number 2 in the series always. Like once they started numbering the books later on in the late 80s, the school stories were always the number 2 book after, you know, the original like Meet Kirsten book, for instance. So here again, we have probably the same doll, if I had to guess, but maybe not. I would imagine they probably had a couple on hand and they might have just left them in their outfits. But we see a lot of resemblances to this Kirsten here, so there's a good chance that this was the same doll, especially because we have these really, really short loop braids, again, that just take me back. This was like Kirsten's hallmark feature, I feel like, was these looped braids, because that was such like a new concept for so many of us at the time. But we have her original school story basically as it stayed for several years. And, you know, we've got the iconic, something very interesting about her dress. There are a few things, like this school story changed a bunch over the years. So we have the original pattern that was on her dress, which is this like division sign print. And I'm guessing they maybe ultimately changed it because it probably wasn't historically accurate if I had to guess, but it was kind of like iconic of being like a school dress. But originally it had this print that was basically just like almost like a Swiss dot pattern, but instead of dots, it was literally division signs. And it ultimately changed to like something that looked a little bit more floral. They changed that like sort of in the early to mid 90s. And then another really interesting thing here, and I reckon that this is a prototype because it doesn't look exactly like mine, but the very original version of the shawl actually didn't have fringe on it, and they're very, very difficult to find. I found one a few years ago for a really great deal, and so I have it in my collection. But yeah, if you'll look really closely, Kirsten's scarf, for the most part, like almost the entire time she was available, had fringe on the edge, and it actually is really pretty. It looks better that way, but the very, very first run of them didn't have any sort of like trim or like fringe detail on the edges. So this looks a lot more like the original version that was sold in 1986, which interestingly was also made by Goods and not the Chinese factories where they started making them in 1987. One real interesting difference we'll notice here is the first versions of this school dress that was sold in 1986 actually had blue stitching on these. I can't remember the historical term for them, but whatever the stitching is on these dresses that, like, I think historically was actually meant to just be a way of like a child growing into the dress, so that you could like let out this row of stitches where it's kind of pleated and stitched down. You take out the stitches and the dress can be lengthened. I think that's ultimately what that was supposed to represent. But the stitching in these was originally a dark navy blue color. And again, something incredibly rare to find. But the ones that Goods made in the very beginning had blue stitching there. And again, that's something we'll probably look at in a later video when I show you my full Kirsten collection from 1986 that is true first edition. But there's a really interesting difference that we have here. One of the most difficult things, I think, to really find a first edition for and know that it's first edition is her school lunch here, which they call Pioneer School Lunch. But it comes with these, like, in the beginning at least, these pieces were made out of resin. So like this bread, sausage, cheese, and apple. They almost feel like a marble. They're sort of like a polystone material. So if you like drop it on a hard table, it makes a really loud clank. They're very, very hard. And again, they sound like marbles when they jangle together. And again, I think this looks very prototypey because again, we can see the fringe on the edge of this napkin is not nearly the length that it is on the ones that actually ended up shipping. And even here, her Tina, which is basically her lunchbox, is also, it looks a little bit different to the original ones, but the originals were laser cut like this, or like laser engraved. They're very, very thin, but this one actually looks a little bit thicker and almost like it has a glaze on it than the original ones. So again, most likely a prototype. And all of this stuff, for the most part, like that we're going to look at today in these catalogs, when we're talking accessories, maybe not so much the outfits, but the accessories for the most part were actually items that were already in production for other companies, and Pleasant Rowland just basically sourced these products and bought them wholesale from companies that were already making them. The company, I believe, that made the food pieces in the early days, I know for like Molly and Samantha for sure, but I'm pretty sure that Silvestri made, it's just a company that made like little miniatures. Their name was Silvestri, and they were the ones that made the food pieces here, but presumably a different company made the Tina, and yet another company made the napkin that came with it. And all of that stuff would be shipped in large bulk boxes to their Middleton, Wisconsin facility. Or was it Madison? I can't remember. I want to say Middleton. But it would have been shipped to their original facility in big boxes and bags, and they would have put them together in gift boxes with stickers and ribbons and all of that in the early days, like packaged that right in Wisconsin before shipping them out. But yeah, all of this stuff was sourced from all different factories and pulled together to, like, sort of, in a way, bootstrap this business, because while she had a lot of money to launch the company that she had saved up for, basically, and invested half of her life savings in, she still had to be pretty scrappy, because there's a lot of stuff that we're going to look at today, and all of this stuff was available from day one. So she really did, even with $1 million to launch the company, still had to be incredibly resourceful, and that's one of the ways she did it. So again, same issue here. Like, a lot of this stuff, maybe not so much this printed stuff, but I can tell here this nap or cloth that's used to like clean off this chalkboard, or what they probably called it, a slate. Yeah, this wiper here looks different than what originally was shipped. So yeah, it's just really fun. And again, I love the background too. Again, this is just so 80s looking to me, but I think if you zoomed out, this was probably from their facility where they photographed a lot of this stuff. So if you look here, like, you have this like whitewashed wood floor, and then like basically this parchment paper that they ripped to kind of have this like deckled edge on it, and it's like this almost like parchment papery background where they set these on it. Because again, you got to remember, Photoshop, I don't know if Photoshop even existed in 1986, but like digital editing was not as common as something like just doing actual airbrushing, and it was very, very expensive and time consuming and not always accurate to digitally correct these things. So that's why, like, all of this stuff was really important to set up correctly in the beginning, so that they had very minimal editing to do when actually putting these catalogs together. So that's why you see like little things like hairs out of place and all that. They were not going to spend money to like Photoshop that to correct it. So I just think it's really fun to kind of think about what all this looked like. And I think we'll see an image later that will kind of show us a little bit more of what this overall studio space looked like. But these images, again, were used for years, and so they're so burned into my brain. So anyway, we'll move over to Kirsten's Surprise, which is Kirsten's Christmas story. Again, one of the most iconic images in this entire catalog. I mean, I just remember having my breath taken away, opening this up and seeing this gigantic wreath with candles on her head. And I grew up in a very, very small town in the South, and we I feel like I had a pretty good education considering, but there just were a lot of things that you didn't know about. I didn't know anything about St. Lucia when I was 6 years old. So this was like a completely new image for me. And I just remember thinking how beautiful it was. And it's still like, even as somebody that celebrates Christmas and doesn't know about St. Lucia, this is still very Christmassy. I mean, like the wreaths, the candles, the red, green, and white. Really, really so incredibly beautiful. And still to this day, one of my favorite outfits and images of all time is this spread right here of Kirsten in her St. Lucia outfit. Another interesting thing here is we have a prototype of her ragdoll sari, which the very first versions of these look very similar to this. And the way you can tell is the fabric on this scarf is actually a little bit different. It sort of has like a stripe and heart pattern on it. And they very quickly changed it to something floral in 1987, like literally like within months. But the very first batch of them had this type of scarf on them. And they looked a little bit different, but overall, they mostly looked like this. The main difference is these original ones, actually, their arms were like sticking straight out perpendicularly. So, and it looks a little bit funny. This actually looks a little bit better than what they ended up shipping. But yeah, the original saris had like arms like I'm not kidding, like stuck straight out. But this is actually one of the pieces that's incredibly difficult to find if you're collecting Kirsten's original collection. The 1986 version of Sari is very, very difficult to get your hands on. I have seen them sell for as much as like $800, which admittedly is quite high. I paid $800 for this entire set, first edition, with Sari, the tray, and like the crown and gown. That was one of my earlier videos on YouTube. If you want to see a really cringy old video, is me unboxing and showing off all of this stuff after getting it for the first time. One of the really interesting things about this set is the very first version of Kirsten's wreath. You can see here how thick this ribbon is here that wraps, like it basically spirals around her wreath. You can see how thick it is here. They basically took that out almost immediately in 1987. But interestingly, the very first versions of these did have this very thick ribbon wrapped around, like coiled around the wreath. In addition to being extra long, it like they brought it all the way down. I'm trying to think of how to describe this, but they basically made chin straps for Kirsten for this wreath. So the very first versions have this same ribbon. It basically comes all the way down. The ribbons are like a foot long, I want to say. And you're meant to like bring them under her chin and tie them in a bow so that I guess it was just meant to help keep it on her head. But I think one of the themes that we start seeing over the years is they did a few like kooky things for the first release of some of these items. And then over the years, they basically tried to pair them back and make them look as much like the catalog as possible, which I'm guessing so they just didn't have to reshoot all of this stuff and do all of it again. They could just send out the same spreads year after year and people wouldn't complain that, a product looked different than it did in the catalog. So a lot of times they would change things to look like the catalog when the very first version didn't even resemble it that much. But yeah, and again, another different thing about these is these candles were very, very tall in 1986 and 1987. This is something they shortened, presumably to save on shipping cost. And again, another like super different thing about this catalog, I can tell that this tray is also a prototype as well. It's very handmade looking like the original ones, but the very, very original ones from 1986 did not have holes in the handles. They were just this little like McDonald's arch shape, basically, with no holes in them. So yeah, just a lot of little idiosyncrasies in all of these that I think are really fun to look at. But overall, this is like one of the most iconic spreads, I think, in all of Pleasant Company history. Okay, interestingly here, we actually have one of the earlier versions of Pleasant Dreams Kirsten, which I think was ultimately, for some reason, changed to Sweet Dreams Kirsten. And this was before Pleasant Company changed its name to American Girl. So this is like the very, very, very first version of this. And I'm guessing they reshot it, A, because It is really hard to see some of these images. Like the printing on a lot of these pages is very grainy. This page looks a lot clearer than this does. And I'm assuming they reshot this just to like brighten things up a little bit, because you really have a hard time seeing this very, very gorgeous first edition version of Kirsten's handmade trunk with all of the extra details that were painted on the front. This was very, very hard for me to find as part of my collection. I did ultimately find one like about 3 years after I started collecting, maybe 2.5. This can be very difficult to find in good condition. Same with her bed from that same year, also very difficult. But I love this spread so much because it really does kind of, again, it's just very nostalgic for a child to think about bedtime and getting dressed for bed. And, you know, for those of you that had dolls, I'm sure tucking them into bed as well, just having like that nighttime ritual, you know, I think is so special to think about. And I think this really evokes that, you know, maybe with the exception that this child is obviously going to bed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because the sun is still out. But I mean, who doesn't remember being young and going to bed with the sun just a little bit still out in the summer? So maybe we'll just pretend that this child actually does live in Scandinavia and it is summertime. It's just like bright at 11 o'clock at night. Who knows? One of the things that I absolutely love about this spread is we have a full scale version of a chair that we won't see until later this year, basically, in the Pleasant Company timeline anyway. This is a life-size scale of Kirsten's chair from her birthday set. So if you remember from her birthday collection, which we won't see today because it wasn't released at this time, Kirsten's table and chairs were made basically handmade out of solid wood, and the chairs that shipped with them were basically complete replicas of the chair that we're looking at now. So this is a little bit of subtle foreshadowing. It's just so incredible to see things like this. To know that this chair actually exists makes me want to search every antique mall in this country to see if I can find one. But how special is it when you can kind of see the original inspiration for something that became such an iconic part of Pleasant Company's product line? To see this chair right here, it's just, there's something so amazing about that. Again, to just see the foreshadowing of what's to come. But again, a lot of stuff was ultimately added to this collection in terms of extras that you could buy, like her shoes and socks and extra ribbons. She ended up getting basically an additional like house coat as part of her bedtime collection. So that was probably another reason that they reshot the bedtime spreads as well, is because they added a lot to them kind of in the beginning, and they really, just needed new images to show them off. But this is the very, very first Pleasant Dreams Kirsten catalog photo that was ever produced. Again, somehow like very 80s to me as well. I think this stuff was so popular. Like this kind of aesthetic was very popular, at least out in the country where I grew up. You would see a lot of this type of stuff in homes in the 80s and 90s. So even though this is meant to be historical, it's still somehow like very 80s, which I guess is also now historical. So, you know, the circle of life. There is something very, very Bonnie Tyler about this like flowy like curtain as well. I feel like the background music to this photo is Total Eclipse of the Heart. That's all I can hear in my head right now, with this long flowing nightgown and this long drapey flowy curtain. And yeah, here we have Kirsten looking absolutely insane, like she just saw her sleep paralysis demon and she's just shot up in bed looking like she is dealing with some very serious PTSD. That is a very, like, it's very clear why they reshot this. I mean, this is not a flattering photo of this doll whatsoever. As much as I love this photo, I definitely understand why they reshot this. All right, next up we have Meet Samantha, which, you know, I think is so interesting that Samantha didn't get priority treatment basically anywhere in this catalog. Again, it might have just been because they had no idea that Samantha was going to be the most popular, but it's so funny that she wasn't on the cover. She wasn't the first doll mentioned. She's literally like the third class citizen of all of these characters. So yeah, here we have Samantha getting second billing in the Pleasant Company catalog, but the same deal as before with Kirsten. I'm trying to remember, did we have lace in Kirsten's spread? Let's look. No, interestingly, we have a Matelassé quilt, basically, as the backing for Kirsten's book. So it's interesting that they changed this up. So, you know, very, very thoughtful. We'll see what we have for Molly. But again, we have the iconic original version of Meet Samantha, where she has the plaid bow instead of the burgundy bow. And again, Same deal with as Kirsten. You could get a hardcover, paperback, or audio cassette. But again, another very, very iconic image. This illustration is so burned into all of our memories, I feel like, because I feel like, especially for those of us that didn't have the dolls, this is how we experienced these stories and found our way into these worlds is through these books. So it's really fun to see a full page dedicated to basically what got us addicted to these dolls in the first place. So yeah, really, really pretty. And again, very moody lighting. I mean, it looks like this was all shot on the same day. And again, this could potentially have been shot with natural light, but it's also possible, if I had to guess, that this was in a studio somewhere potentially, because again, we have this same like whitewashed floor and these like parchment. This might not even be a real wall, honestly. There's a very good chance that they put up a piece of paper and this is like a fake baseboard here, and this is why we only see a little bit of the curtain. And there's a very good chance that it was just like a studio light shining in here to like create this vignette here. It's really beautiful, but I think this was actually shot in the same studio. I don't think this is somebody's bedroom. Again, because the footboard is like right up against the wall. This is probably a false wall with an actual studio light creating all of this, which is fun to think about, sometimes. Although maybe for some of you it's ruining the magic. But yeah, very, very similar lighting here. And again, we have that same like whitewashed like wood floor on the bottom with just a little bit of what's probably like a tablecloth with like lace detailing in it. Just very, very particular. And, I just love seeing all of these extra props that were added in here that, weren't things you could buy. Like you couldn't buy this chair or this bed or anything, but it just really creates an overall vibe that really helped sell us on the lifestyle of Pleasant Company. And yet again, we have the double page spread of Samantha Parkington, the doll, which, this version of Samantha, I think, is probably the single most coveted doll in all of Pleasant Company history. This is the one that people fight over in Facebook groups and on eBay and scratch eyeballs out and tear hair out to get. I have a few of them I've been trying not to hoard, but this is the very, very first version of Samantha, which I think honestly is a prototype, again, to look at her. There are some key differences we see in this catalog versus the original Samantha dolls. Most notably, her bangs. You don't see original Pleasant Company dolls with bangs quite this short. They did trim them shorter for these prototypes. And, I've heard all kinds of stories as to why the bangs were long. Somebody, again, this is not fact checked. I do not know. But somebody I remember seeing in a Facebook group once upon a time saying that this kind of hairstyle, like having bangs like this, wasn't popular in Germany. So the factory workers that were making and also I think these wigs were made in China. I don't think the wigs were actually made by Goetz in Germany. I think they probably had the wigs made in China and then they used the parts to assemble the dolls in West Germany at the time. But yeah, it's very likely that this is a prototype and they trimmed the bangs up. This is, I think, the correct length for bangs on a Pleasant Company doll, just aesthetically. But if you've seen some of the original Pleasant Company Samanthas, especially from 1986, I have one whose bangs go all the way past her nose. You can stick her bangs in her mouth. They're that long. So some sort of communication error was happening somewhere. If I had to guess, it's possible that the bangs were probably cut longer than they needed to be. And just some communication error when people started gluing them on in the Goetz factory. They were gluing them too far forward instead of like making this little hole in the top of the wig further back. They put it like right on the top of the head. For whatever reason, the bangs in the 80s were very, very long. And this hair is actually quite short. Samantha's hair was a little bit longer than this. For pretty much most of her life. I don't know if I've ever seen an authentic uncut haired Samantha with hair this long. This is a little bit short. So this doll definitely got a haircut. And I have to say, to me, this is actually the best looking version of her with the way these bangs are. We have like the lighter hair. We can argue whether or not Samantha's hair getting darker was a good thing. I guess it technically was, but I do like this shade of like, I don't know, it's like is it a chestnut or auburn brown? Same color as Molly's, basically. We have her iconic bow. And her eyes, as pictured in this catalog, I do want to say are what collectors will refer to as amber. They're not the brightest amber eyes I've ever seen, but they're certainly not that like deep chocolatey color that we've come to know over the years to be associated with Samantha. Her eyes changed quite a bit over the years, but this is the very first version that have this really like reddish light brown, almost like a cinnamon color almost. And we also have what we kind of colloquially call spider lashes. The eyelashes on Samantha were actually very hard. They are almost like, I don't know how to describe them actually. I almost think of them as like a mascara brush or something, but they're very, very like hard and wiry, and they were very, very fragile. So that's ultimately, I think, why they changed them. It helped make them consistent with Molly and Kirsten. But yeah, Samantha's original eyes were very, very wiry and prone to falling out. I don't like them at all. I am glad that they ultimately changed them. But this is the very first version of her, again, with these very, very small hand-painted teeth that collectors refer to as chipped teeth. We have an original prototype, basically, of her hat. We have some differences in the ribbon color that wraps around the brim, not the brim, but like whatever this part of the hat is called. And we also have very short ribbons on the back. These ultimately, to the best of my knowledge, were always super long and hung down like tails. And these they may have done this for the catalog. They were very, very short, and basically the like tails of these bows on the back of this hat were about as long as the loops for the bows. Yeah, this is very interesting. I've seen a couple people claim to have these. I'm not sure if they're authentic or not, because people customize and do things all the time. I have not seen enough of these to know that they ever shipped ones that looked like this. It's always possible, but for the most part, even the very, very earliest Samanthas that you buy are going to have very long ribbons. And again, they might have just cut them short just so that they could fit in frame. Who knows? But again, we have this whitewashed wood floor and this like deckled edge on this parchment paper. What I guess another very interesting thing before we move on to her next spread is we do have a handkerchief that I don't think was ever sold with Samantha's. Again, this is a prototype hanky. The one that they changed it a few times over the years, but certainly the 1986 one looked nothing like what we can see here. So yeah, this is a fun little detail that, this is a hanky that doesn't technically exist as a product that was sold by Pleasant Company. This was a prototype. All right, and here we have Samantha's both school and Christmas story all in one spread. We will actually look at this, and there's not much to look at here. We'll touch on this in a second, but again, like Kirsten, we have the number 2 book in her story, which is Samantha's school story, and we have what appears here to be another prototype. I've seen something very similar to this recently, but I believe this is a prototype or something very, very rarely sold. And we have the original version of Samantha's Buster Brown dress that was manufactured in West Germany by Goetz. One of the most interesting things about this is a much thicker, like woolly fabric than what they ultimately changed to in like 1987. So the earliest versions of this are very, very nice. I have a couple of them. They have these like clear translucent buttons, but these were changed very quickly to have a thinner, I don't know what fabric this is, if it's wool or what. It feels like wool to me, but they changed it to more of a felt-like material and they put solid white buttons on it. So this is the very, very first version of Samantha's Buster Brown dress that you can find on eBay. If you look around long enough, these do show up from time to time, and I can tell you that this version is so much higher quality than the versions that they made in China. They used really great materials on these, and the later versions just weren't quite as thick and nice as this one. So I always recommend, like, if you're really trying to get like that early high quality Pleasant Company look, this is something to invest in and try to find the first version of this that was made in West Germany, because they are really, really high quality. And again, nothing majorly different about this than what shipped ultimately by Pleasant Company in 1986 and the years following. But one fun fact about me is I actually have the prototype of this. Now, I think it might have been one that they were considering changing the straps on, but there's actually a singular version of this that has brown straps on here instead of red. And I haven't shown it to anybody yet. This is sort of like maybe a spoiler for a later video, because I do have a bunch of Pleasant Company prototypes, and this is one of them, is a prototype of the version of this that they were at least considering making the straps on this brown, and I have it in my possession. It's one of my most prized possessions. So yeah, I do have a prototype of Samantha's strap and supplies. Really quickly, we'll jump over to Samantha's Christmas story because it's next in line. And again, I think I can speak for most of us when I say that these Christmas spreads are some of the most nostalgic, warm feeling images to look at because I think so many of us know that feeling of, it getting to be after Thanksgiving and Christmas is coming up and you're just really hoping you get that doll for Christmas and you spend so much time begging your parents for this doll, being really sure that you want it, looking at every single detail, imagining what this dress feels like to put on the doll and cuddle and brushing her hair to make it look this neat and tidy. And that's my strongest memory is the desire to have the doll because I never had the doll. But I think so many of you probably know that same feeling. And this is, again, just one of those instantly recognizable spreads with Samantha's original Christmas story. This dress has changed quite a few times over the years. I think they finally settled in on a design in the early 90s, but this is a prototype of the very first version. I can tell here that this is not made out of taffeta. This looks like a much more cottony material. I always envisioned this being a softer material when I was envisioning having one of these, but I could be completely wrong. It does say here that it's made out of taffeta, so I don't know. It's potential that the prototype wasn't made out of taffeta, but maybe it's just the way the lighting is. But to me, it doesn't look like velvet, but it feels like it looks like it would feel a little bit softer than taffeta. The original version of this does have this, like, I don't know what this shape is in these hearts. It almost looks like chili peppers, but I think ultimately maybe this was meant to be leaves and not hearts. I don't know, but this is the original lace that they used in the very, very first versions of this dress that were released in 1986. And then they changed the dress, I think, 2 times in 1987 and then again in 1988 and ultimately ended up with a darker burgundy. But the original version of this dress is actually a darker color than it is shown here. It actually is a little bit more of a burgundy color. And then in 1987, they made them super bright fire engine red, which I think was a bad move. I don't really like those dresses. A lot of people think that they're the first version, but they're actually just a change they made in 87, I think, to maybe compensate to make them look a little bit more of a bright red like this looks in the catalog. But then ultimately they pulled it all the way back and made them like a dark burgundy. But there was a version of this that was sold in 1990 that had like a shorter ribbon like this. But yeah, some changes that were made all over the place with this. But Samantha's cranberry party dress is one that's fun to collect if you like to collect versions of things, because I think there are like 6 versions of it overall that you can collect. And they're all relatively easy to find. Samantha was incredibly popular. She was the most popular doll that Pleasant Company sold. So in turn, her outfits and accessories are the easiest to find from the earliest years. So, if you're looking at getting into collecting early stuff and you want to kind of start with some low-hanging fruit, Samantha and her original collection really are the best place to start, with the exception, one thing is going to drive you absolutely crazy to get, and it's this thing right here, which is her real gingerbread house. So this was basically a craft project. I think it was basically originally their first craft project that they ever sold. And you could buy a real gingerbread house kit. Like, you would buy the cookies and it would come with a bag of candies and a piping bag and instructions. I'm trying to think what else came with it. I actually have this from 1986, believe it or not, the original edible version of the gingerbread house. And it took me a long time to find it. I think this might be the single rarest item that we're going to see in this catalog. I've only seen it for sale once and I bought it. So you can get later versions of it. They will show up from time to time. You can get them in different boxes. Alrighty, I had to take a quick little break because my camera overheated, probably because it was so excited about all of the awesome stuff we've been looking at today. But this might actually be a good opportunity for me to say thank you for hanging out with me, and if you want to hit the like button on the video, that helps my channel out. It helps videos like this get better engagement, and it helps me reach more people so that I can continue making these videos. And Yeah, I'll put a quick spiel in here. Why not? Don't forget to check out my Patreon. That's another really great way to help support this channel so that I can keep making insanely detailed doll videos like this. And there's a lot of content like this over on my Patreon as well, if you want to check that out. But yeah, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and check out my Patreon. All right, let's hop back into Samantha because I was basically boasting about one of my biggest scores in my collection, which is Samantha's real life gingerbread house. Now, I can't remember exactly where I left off, but basically what I was trying to get at is it is hard enough to find any version of this gingerbread house on eBay or Mercari or wherever you find these things, because this was actual real food that they were selling. It wasn't like some resin, this or that. They sold and shipped these basically as something that you would put together around Christmas time and then eat, I guess, the day after. When do we eat gingerbread houses? Are they meant to ever be eaten? They're edible. Anyway, if you ever ate a gingerbread house, let me know. So these are real food. You basically, I think they have a frosting recipe in here, so you don't get any actual like liquid frosting, but off the top of my head, like I mentioned before, you get a bag of cookies, love the gingerbread cookies, and a bag of candy, a piping bag with a tip and instructions. I think that's all that comes in these. But yeah, from any year, I think stopped selling them in the late 90s, but they are very, very hard to find, all original with unbroken cookies and all the original candies. And this was probably the single item I had the most trouble finding at all for my collection. I lucked out and found like a 1991 version, I think about a year into my collecting, and then another year and a half in or so, I ended up finding the very, very first version that was in the burgundy box with the satin ribbon and the sticker on the front. Near impossible to find, as you can imagine. They only made that version for probably about a year, maybe a year and a half. I don't know how many of these they were selling in the springtime, so they probably didn't keep a lot of stock of these things. So yeah, I ended up finally finding one. In my opinion, this is the single rarest item to find for Pleasant Company. There might be something that I'm forgetting, but it's really hard to imagine anything more difficult than this to find, especially brand new in the packaging, first edition. And I am very proud to say that I have the very first mint condition version of this, and if I were to sell, if I, for whatever reason, had to sell most of my collection and only keep very few things, for whatever reason that needed to be, this is the one single item, as far as accessories go, that I will never ever let go of. This will be the last thing to go in my collection. So just know if I'm selling this, I am done. Unless I found a duplicate and I'm trying to make a huge profit on it, but that probably not going to happen. But yeah, very, very rare to find one of these things, and I probably should stop boasting about it. This version of Clara right here actually is also another thing that Pleasant Roland actually just sourced as a wholesale item. These were made by a company called Kurt Adler, and they are Christmas ornament manufacturers, and they've been in business for decades. And this was originally just a Clara Christmas ornament. In fact, the very original versions of these that were made in the early 80s, you can find some with copyrights as early as like 1980, definitely 84, possibly 83. They were around for a few years before Pleasant Roland bought them and repurposed them as dolls for Samantha. But this is just a straight up Christmas ornament. The earliest versions of these actually have like a gold loop in their head, and so do some of these other items actually. The earliest versions of these can have a gold Christmas ornament loop as well, because these were also made by Kurt Adler. The same company that made this also made this, and these are just repurposed Christmas ornaments that they repackaged and sold as doll accessories. So that is a fun fact about a lot of the early stuff from Pleasant Company, is they are just repurposed Christmas ornaments. And we're going to see a few more in Molly's collection as well. So here is Samantha's iconic Christmas spread. Again, one of my absolute favorites in the entire Pleasant Company collection. Yet again, we have a Pleasant Dreams Samantha spread, again with a very odd stochastic printing, very weirdly lit. But again, you can see that they've gone in and done some, set dressing. It's very, very like grandma's house in the 80s, but we love that now. I mean, grandma was really onto something. But you can actually see that they have a blanket here that's very reminiscent of Samantha's original bedding that they made in this first version. And we have what appears to be a very bright-eyed Samantha. But like, just to look at this catalog, the printing in here is so bad. And this was probably a combination of like low light and the camera not picking up. Like, again, without getting into it too much, if there's really low light, especially with cameras that are like much older or not as good quality, that don't have great sensors in them, a lot of times you get a lot of grain in photos. So that could be contributing to some of this graininess that we're seeing as low light. Again, same studio. We've got this like baseboard with the parchment walls, the what is, I'm assuming, the same whitewash floor. So again, a very bright-eyed Samantha, even though we can barely see her in this low light. We have the original version of Samantha's trunk that has a different paper pattern that lines the inside of it than the one we know most commonly. For about a year, because you can find these from 1987 lots as well, they had a different pattern on the inside of the trunk. But interestingly, this is definitely a prototype or something that they've modified, because the emblem on this trunk in this spread here is on the side, basically where the clasps are. To my knowledge, I've never seen one, and so I don't think that they actually sold these with the emblem on the side. At some point, I would like to find a really beat up trunk to actually harvest one of these to put on the side of one of my 86 trunks, because I think it would be really fun to have one that looks just like the catalog. But this is one of those differences from the prototypes that you only see in the catalogs and never really see in person. And interestingly, now that I'm like sitting here examining this, another difference that I have just noticed for the first time in years is that the handles on these drawers are actually not the same as the handles that were shipped in the original trunks. So yeah, definitely a prototype. Very, very, very interesting. I would love to get my hands on this prototype one day, but who knows where this ever ended up. You know, maybe Pleasant Roland still has it. Who knows? But again, another beautiful collection. Very weirdly lit and grainy, but at the same time, just so incredibly iconic. Another thing that I'm looking at here, this is another prototype that we're looking at, is Samantha's nightgown. If you can look really closely, I don't know if you'll be able to tell, but her her sleeves are very like asymmetrical. One fell down and one sticking up, but the lace on this on her sleeves and her neck on this nightgown are lace patterns that have never been seen on actual real Samantha nightgowns from 1986 until her retirement. So this is yet another prototype that's really fun to look at in the catalogs. And honestly, I feel like you wouldn't really know the difference just to look at this and order it and get it, but definitely a different lace pattern with this interesting scalloping on the side. I think it's just such a fun insight into some of the earliest stuff of Pleasant Company to look at these catalogs, because some of these images were changed. Again, most of them were used year after year after year, but some of these images like this one, you don't really see a whole lot. And you can really kind of look and play like investigator and see like, oh, that's not really exactly how that was. And again, another fun thing too, they might have coded them in later years, but Samantha's original T10, is it a T10? Oh, it's not on this page, so I can't look it up. But her original lunchbox, like her T10 lunch, is what I think it was called. They were originally like a bright, polished, unlacquered brass, and if you know anything about unlacquered brass, it patinas over time. So whenever you buy these days, unless it's actually just been kept wrapped up and sealed and airtight for, almost 40 years, these are almost always really, really, really tarnished. And I've never been brave enough to try to polish one, because I think they're probably just like have a very thin brass coating on them. So I feel like if you take Brasso or something to it, it's probably just going to take all of that off and turn it silver. So I haven't been brave enough to do it. But yeah, originally these shipped and they were a bright, shiny brass. And then over the years, yeah, they just patina and tarnish and they get really, really dark, which can be very beautiful. I actually love that in most instances, but I would really love to see the original shine on my Samantha T10 lunch, if I'm perfectly honest. But yeah, this is Pleasant Dreams Samantha, yet another original icon of the early Pleasant Company days. And finally, we're going to be looking at Molly, the poor little child that was ultimately everyone's least favorite. I mean, not me. I would want to say that Molly was probably my favorite for the longest. I really think just over the years, picked a new favorite probably every other day. And when I got tired of wanting Molly and really obsessing over her books and pictures in the catalog, I'd just move on and be like, okay, now I really want Kirsten. So, they were all my favorite at one point, most likely, but Molly is really the one that I love the most as an adult. She's just, I don't know, her aesthetic and everything really speaks to me. So, yeah, we have again the same Meet Molly spread. Before we even get to see the doll, we have the original book. And one thing that's really fun about Molly is they changed her character illustrations fairly early on. In 1988, they actually switched illustrators and they completely redid her books. But this is the original illustration for Meet Molly. And all throughout these books, if you get an original copy of this before 1988, the drawings are just a little bit different and Molly looks different. In my opinion, she does a little bit look like a little old lady, but I love that. I mean, technically Molly could still be alive and be a little old lady today. So, I really do like this original illustration of her. But I do love the second one as well. I really, I think really more remember the second illustrations, if I'm honest, because again, 1991, I think was really like 1991 was probably around the time I was discovering this and getting into it. And her illustrations had changed by then. So when I was getting brand new books at like Sam's Club or whatever, they had the new illustrations. But this, again, is the very, very original version of Meet Molly with her original illustrations. And the rest of her books in this spread, in this catalog, will have those. I just remembered I forgot to go back and talk about really quickly this little insert here. There wasn't a whole lot to talk about, but before like moving further, some of this stuff I think is like the most fun to look at as well. Like just this was the original order form right here. So you had to, this is how you did things before the internet. When you got a catalog in the mail, you'd have to actually like fill this whole thing out, like the page number. I guess this was all like part of like being sure you knew exactly what you were ordering, but it's really fun to think about like actually going in and writing all of this out. But there's some extra paraphernalia here that I wanted to look at really quickly before moving on to the rest of Molly's spreads, basically. Of course, we have like a quality guarantee here, but I mean, like, honestly, if you were getting any of this stuff and had, like, especially in the context of like 1980s dolls and toys and had any complaint at all, you were definitely a Karen if you complained about the quality of the stuff. Barring a manufacturing defect, and a weird anomaly, they really stood by their work here. I mean, Pleasant Rowland, you could tell, absolutely loved this brand and gave her everything to it. So she stood by it. And I think, I'm not surprised because this was the best doll company in the world, in my opinion, at the time. And honestly, again, when we're talking mainstream Playline dolls, I still think American Girl is the best. So yeah, Pleasant Rowland standing by her brand and her promises. Yeah, just no shocker at all. One really fun thing here is you can actually buy an extra set of coat hangers. And I think by 1987, I couldn't guarantee you that this was the exact same order form that was in the 1986 catalogs. There's always a chance that they've changed it. I'm just gonna see. Yeah, I don't see a copyright year on here anywhere. So this could be updated, but it's interesting that you could buy black coat hangers at this time. Now, I do know that both when we were talking about Samantha's trunk earlier, her trunk actually shipped with gold hangers instead of black originally in 1986, but ultimately they changed her coat hangers to black in 1987. So you can still find versions of her trunk that had the original version of the paper lining, but they also come with black hangers instead of gold. So 1987 is when they started doing like the black powder coated wire hangers instead of like having Molly's be silver, which we'll get at in a second, and Samantha's be gold. They consolidated to one single color. So it's interesting, as soon as 1987, you could order extra coat hangers because I guess another thing to mention about this is they did not ship their outfits with coat hangers until 1988. When you purchased this in 1986 or 1987, it just shipped in a gift box with tissue paper. It did not have one of those plastic coat hangers that we have all come to know and love. So if you wanted an extra coat hanger to hang this in her trunk, for instance, if you ended up getting more than 3 outfits, you'd have to buy extra coat hangers because you didn't get them originally with the outfits. Here's another fun thing that kind of shows up from time to time is these like book plates with this bookmark. These can get kind of expensive. I've seen them sell for like $20, $25 before, but yeah, I've gotten quite a few of these in lots before because, I guess a lot of kids got these dolls and their parents were like, okay, if you're getting the doll, you're going to read all these freaking books. So you'll often see a lot of these kinds of things with collections because I feel like it might have been, for a lot of kids, maybe a stipulation of getting the doll in the first place is that they had to read the books. So that's probably what that's for. We have the very, very first version of the hairbrush, which is a borderless Pleasant Company logo that's basically debossed into the hairbrush and very, very slightly, and it's printed in white. And usually the printing on these is not very good. The ones that I've seen and the one that I have is very, like, not printed very great. So they've done a few versions of this over the years and then ultimately ended up at the brushes that they have today, which are great. I do not care for these original brushes. They are very, very like scratchy and scrappy. These I only have as part of like my collection and for display. I do not use these hairbrushes. Another thing on here that I have been looking for, and I don't know if I'll ever find it because it's just such an odd thing to like ultimately have, is a gift certificate because it's printed on a similar paper, almost identical to what the certificate of authenticity or the certificates of authenticity that came with the signed dolls. These gift certificates were very, very similar. So I would love to ultimately find somebody's gift certificate, but I would imagine you had to surrender it at the time of purchase. So there's probably very few, if any, of these in existence. But this is something that I'm on the hunt for because I really want to try and get one of everything that was ever available, including this kind of stuff. So yeah, weirdly, as just like a first edition psychotic collector, this is something that I'm after. And speaking of things that collectors really, really seek after, this is the original packaging that all of this stuff came in, and they really referred to it more as gift boxes rather than packaging. Because again, when you remember, like you're ordering these things in a catalog, you're not going into a store to purchase them, like put them in your cart and check out. You have already made up your mind about what you're purchasing. So the idea of like making specific packages for all of these different outfits wasn't really a big necessity at the time. And one of the ways they saved money on packaging was doing the same thing for every single dress for every single character. So this is really beautiful here. I'm actually going to read this in case you can't, because this is one of the most quintessential hallmarks of early Pleasant Company. We're talking basically the first 2 years of the company is the only time you can find these specific gift box types. And I covet them so much. Everyone I can get my hands on, I'll get my hands on because it's such a relic of the past and they can be very difficult to find. But it says, gift boxes. The American Girls collection has been conceived and executed with thought and care. All merchandise is packaged in beautiful gift boxes, tied with our special ribbon and topped with a sticker, at no charge to you. For your convenience, we also provide additional wrapping with gift paper for a modest charge of $2. Can you imagine? I felt like that would be, I think they might do that still. I'm not sure, but it's probably $15 now. Please use the order form column to indicate those items you would like wrapped. We will write your message on our card or enclose your own card with your order. You will receive confirmation of all gift shipments. So really, really cool. And interestingly here, doll beds and trunks cannot be gift wrapped. So very, very interesting. I love seeing this, like as minty as it gets, these original bright burgundy boxes with the tissue paper, ribbon, and sticker. Oh, it's nearly impossible to get them in this good a condition these days, but I've got some pretty good ones. So anyway, very, very special. I just wanted to hop back and look at all of this because it really is such an important part of just the overall vibe of Pleasant Company. I love these little things that kind of give you a peek at what things were really like in the past. Okay, back to Molly. We have her double page spread, and I have to say, of all of the dolls, I think she's probably maybe the most like what she actually shipped as, with a couple of changes. One thing you'll notice very quickly is that her braids look a little bit on the short side, and I do think that these were chopped just ever so slightly shorter than most of them shipped with, although some original Mollies do have quite short braids, but if I had to guess, I would say this is like maybe a centimeter too short, but really beautiful factory braids. And I think one thing that's very interesting is in these catalogs, they used to brush out their bangs and kind of floof them out a little bit more, but most of us collectors tend to have them as they shipped, where, they're just like a lot cleaner and basically like a bowl cut. I always laugh, like Molly, for instance, to me is like a bowl cut with pigtails. Like the bangs were just so long and voluminous and just literally a bowl cut. I mean, kind of as you can see here, but they did try and like part them out and floof them a little bit in the catalogs, which I think is always really fun. It kind of gives you permission to play with their hair a little bit, but don't you dare take those factory braids out. So again, one other like really interesting thing here that most people might not notice is that the ribbons that they use in her hair appear to be higher quality than what they ultimately shipped these dolls in for basically the entirety of Pleasant Company as it was owned by Pleasant Rowland. They had really, really thin taffeta ribbons that were basically transparent and really floppity. Like you can't get them to be this stiff and like clean looking. And I would venture to say these ribbons are actually a little bit thicker than what actually, as far as like the width of the actual ribbon, they are wider than Molly's ribbons ever ended up being. So definitely a prototype thing. Interestingly here, the chain on her necklace is one like we will start to see more in the mid 90s. The earliest chains didn't quite look like this. They were a lot more dense with links. So that's another thing again, like I said, I think they changed to make resemble older things, or maybe it was cheaper, I don't know, but that's not what the 1986 chains looked like, interestingly. And one other thing, we'll talk about two other things. Like the original Mollies tend to have very light gray eyes, and they did vary. Like just because a Molly has like a standard gray eye doesn't mean that her eyes have been swapped or repainted poorly or whatever. But my most favorite Mollies from the 1980s, well, I guess 1986 mainly, are the ones that have really light gray eyes. They just, I don't know, they have like a light behind them almost. I really, really like them, but Molly's eyes did have some variations over the years. And then again, since we're just going and talking about every little detail, one very, very interesting detail on Molly's glasses is these are obviously the very first version of them that didn't have lenses because they were made by Goots, and Goots dolls had glasses just like these without lenses, and they're basically wires and they have this very interesting hinge in them. But interestingly enough, while they did make glasses like these, the ones that they used for Pleasant Company dolls, starting from the very beginning, there's actually a bend in the arm on these glasses. So I don't know if you can see this super clearly, but the arm on these glasses goes straight back. It is straight as an arrow, like from the part where it touches like the front of the frames and goes back to her ear, basically. That is very, very straight. Whereas Molly's, actually, I have a Molly right here. Let me see if I can bring her out, because this will be the only way I'll be able to describe this. But if you can see, oh, this one has like kind of bent, but this is basically what they look like. I don't know if you can tell here, but this Molly actually has sort of an arc and a bend in those side pieces to her frames. So that is one of the differences in the prototypes versus what they really shipped. This is a 1986 Molly, but this is the version that had big teeth. They shipped versions that had small chipped teeth like this one and ones with big teeth, but the big tooth dolls were never pictured in the catalog until 1987, I want to say. So this is the big tooth version of Molly, but you can see the glasses are very similar. No lenses. These are made out of nickel, so if they get humid and aren't taken care of properly, they can turn her, like they can basically dye her vinyl green, basically in the exact same way that original Barbies would get green ear. You can actually get, I don't know if you'd call it green face with Molly if her glasses are on in the improper environment. She can get the same exact condition as green ear on her face. Oh, and just really quickly also, just in case you were wondering, Molly's original glasses were strapped to the back of her head with elastics like this, and this doll would be the same way. Unless, realistically, they probably could have taken the elastic off and just shoved that in her braid so that's hidden. But this type of glasses has this little loop here that you can see at the end that the elastic loops through, and it basically stretches over their head. And Molly was made like this until mid 1988. So for about, a year and a half, maybe a little more, this is how Molly's glasses were. And then in 1988, they completely redesigned them and gave her lenses, like little plastic clear lenses in them. So yeah, I just think that's a really fun fact. I feel like I know basically everything there is to know about Molly because she went under so many changes over the years that I just got really obsessed and learned everything that I possibly could. So that's Meet Molly with her hand raised up in the air. Her vinyl color looks really light here, doesn't it? But again, I'm pretty sure that these are prototypes. I would love to see these dolls in person just to see like the original ones that we all looked at and wanted. So again, we have number 2 in Molly's story, which is Molly's school story. Molly learns a lesson. And this outfit underwent a lot of changes. This prototype here looks very, very similar, if not exact, to what they ultimately ended up making. The lace on here is a little bit different. You can see like the collar is like just a little strange on here compared to what shipped. And the fabric is thicker than what they ultimately used. But again, just slightly different than what they were shipping in 1986. And we have a very early prototype version of her lunch. Again, I've never seen a sandwich look like this from 1986. It's just all a little bit different, just every little thing in here for the most part just looks a little bit different because they, in many cases, were prototypes that, like, I would not be surprised if these were handmade. They certainly, if you've seen the earliest versions of Molly's Lunch, they look like they are actually individually hand sculpted and not cast into molds. So very, very interesting. A lot of very, like, handmade looking things. Again, we have the original illustrations of Molly for Molly Learns a Lesson. This is the ones that were done in 1986, possibly 1985 as the company was getting developed. But yeah, this is not really my favorite look for Molly. Actually, you can see here, again, if we're talking dolls, this is not the same doll from the cover because you can tell like her braids are, I think, a little bit longer than the original one here. You can see like how long that is versus like these. I think this is a different doll, which is very interesting. All right, under Molly's Christmas story, this is really the rabbit hole that if you collect Molly that you're going to fall down into. And for whatever reason, the Christmas stories just underwent so many changes over the years for all 3 of these girls, and Molly was no exception. There are so many variations of these. Again, we've got a doll that looks much more similar to the one we just saw with these very, very short, like chopped off braids. Interestingly, the ribbons that they used for her, again, I would say are just probably craft store ribbons as they were just putting all the stuff together. But you could see that they've basically like wrapped her braids almost like a tourniquet like 1,000 times before tying the bow. These ribbons were never this long, but another really interesting detail is they used a really nice velvet for this dress for the prototype, but the original velvet dresses for Molly up until about 1990 were made with really poor quality velvet, in my opinion. It's very, very thin and just, I don't know, it just tends to like fade a little bit. It's not very nice velvet. When they switched the velvet right before adding the buttons to the front of this in the early 90s, I want to say it was like 92 or 93, I can't remember. There's a version of this without the buttons that's really, really nice with the new velvet, and that was really good velvet that they ended up using. But yeah, the first versions, not very good velvet at all, and definitely a prototype because this lace here almost looks like it's made out of paper to me. It almost has like a doily quality to it, and it's obviously very large compared to what they ended up using. So again, this is something that was never really ultimately available, but I have like contemplated over the years seeing if I could find this same trim or something very similar and making a catalog version of her dress just with that really big ruffly lace trim. But definitely this is not how it looked as it shipped in later years. And then again, ultimately in the early 90s they added buttons to the front, which I think looked really cute and I think were a great addition. But this is the original prototype version of Molly's Christmas dress. One thing that changed a lot as well over the years was Molly's Christmas stocking. I think that there are all in about 6 different versions of this wood ballerina, and they often had trouble getting stock of these, so they would swap it out for other items. So like this particular version is incredibly difficult to find. I have only been able to get my hands on 2 of them in the years that I've been collecting. And so yeah, this is again for Molly one of the hardest things to find, maybe the second hardest. And then the rest of the things that came with her are pretty common. Again, this yo-yo, which interestingly, this is something that started out different as they shipped it in like 86, 87, 88. They ultimately did get red and yellow yo-yos, but most of the yo-yos from the early days are like purple and green and like wood colored. So that's another fun thing to collect versions of because I think there are like somewhere around 5 or 6 versions of the yo-yo over the years. There were probably another 3 or 4 versions of the paint set. The barrettes had an alternate version. They're all different kinds of like candy canes that you can get as well, made out of different materials. But yeah, interestingly, like both this ballerina and this candy cane were originally Christmas ornaments that they basically just, in most cases, yanked out the loop and just sold them as part of Molly's collection. But yeah, these are both Christmas ornaments technically. What I would say is probably the most difficult thing to find in Molly's collection is the very first version of her nurse and snow globe, which is, I think they call it Molly's Christmas box. But they very, very quickly changed this in 1987. And I want to say they probably only did one run of this original version with this nurse that people will call the creepy nurse. But the original nurse looked basically pretty much exactly like this. And she had sleep eyes. And she's made out of very, very thin, brittle plastic. It's very similar to a lot of the like souvenir dolls that you could buy at the time. They're very, very cheaply made and very, very fragile. Their arms are strung on with just literally a rubber band. I think the hat is glued on. They're very, very cheap quality, so they change them quickly. But to get your hands on one of these is nearly impossible. I've once saw one go for sale on eBay and I just missed it. Somebody beat me by seconds. They got her, just the nurse, but they got her for $15. There's one that's been sitting on eBay for a couple of years that the seller's asking for $1,500 just for the nurse without shoes, which in my opinion is obviously way too high to charge because nobody's purchased it yet. But this version of this nurse is so hard to find. I ended up finding one on eBay a few years ago and got my hands on it. And unfortunately, I had to like fight to be able to keep the order because people were emailing the seller offering them more money for it. And I paid a good amount of money for this. I paid hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for this original set, but people were still willing to pay more. And I almost lost it because people were being real jerks and selfish and bratty and messaging the seller trying to buy this out from under me. But luckily it was a very honest seller. So I do have this original set complete with like the nurse, snow globe, and box, and it's one of the most prized possessions in my Molly collection. In fact, when we moved from Oregon to North Carolina, we drove over here. We loaded up a moving van, like a gigantic moving van. I won't get into it all, but when we drove over, we had just enough space in our car for our dog and a few select things, including like overnight bags to stay in hotels. And with me in the car, I brought one doll, which is my lowest number signed Samantha that I paid thousands of dollars for. And then I brought my Samantha gingerbread kit that I just bragged about a minute ago. And I brought Molly's Christmas stuff, like all of this stuff that I had first edition and rare. That came with me in the car because I was so terrified something was going to happen to it. Like, I don't care if the moving company broke all our TVs and all our nice furniture. I was going to be devastated if this stuff got lost or damaged. So I basically brought it with me in my lap for like 5 or 6 days in the car. So that's how much this stuff is coveted and sought after, is like once you get it, you guard it with your life. Like seriously, I'm tempted to go get a lockbox at the bank and put all this stuff in there. Okay, after a short break because my camera imploded, we're going to pick back up with Pleasant Dreams Molly, which again is one of my favorite spreads because I love these like bedtime routine ones. We obviously have like this super cozy look. And again, we have a completely new set here. We've got more of like, I don't know how World War II this actually is. I mean, Pleasant would probably have known better than I do, but we have this very like IKEA look, like flat pack looking bed, which is a far cry from the kinds of things we have like for Samantha, for instance. But again, another really grainy photo that we didn't really see a whole lot of over the years because yet again, we just have like, I want to say like, it's vibey. Like, don't get me wrong, I love this and it's vibey, but it really doesn't show off the product super well, obviously. Like, we don't even know for sure if this is actually Molly or if it's Samantha. Because one of the interesting things I have seen in the past is those craft kits that they used to sell, they actually used to sell the dress patterns for the dolls. I think they started doing it either in the very late 80s or the early 90s, and you could actually buy the like patterns for like your grandmother or whoever in your family was, you know, could sew. They could actually make replicas of the original Pleasant Company outfits for the dolls. And in Molly's, for her pajamas, her pajamas, not her pajamas. There was actually an image of Samantha wearing Molly's pajamas. I don't know why they did this. I'm guessing because they wanted a doll with the hair down, and they didn't want to take the factory braids out of Molly, like the prototype doll, so they just stuck it on Samantha, hoping nobody would notice. But yeah, so there's a chance that this is that doll, like basically Samantha with Molly's glasses on. We don't know because the image is so dark, but we do have all of the original 1986 versions of all of these products, I guess we'll call them. It seems cheap to call them products, but one of the most notable 1986 items we have in this catalog is the original version of Molly's trunk that has a different star pattern to the one that we all have come to know and love over the years. The star pattern in this, even though you can't see it super well, is a very like, it's sort of like a cross section of an apple. It's sort of like 5 little lines that sort of make a star shape. It has like a very Asian look. It's very, very elegant, as opposed to like your typical like 5-sided star that we normally associate with American Girl. So that's probably one of the biggest differences in this. Oh, it's certainly the biggest difference in this particular trunk from Molly's, later editions. It does look like we might have those slightly bigger pulls on the drawers in the trunk as well, similar to as we saw with Samantha. And also, like Samantha, we have a Pleasant Company laser cut metal emblem on the side of the trunk as opposed to the top. Now, to my knowledge, I don't think that they ever made them like this. This was either a prototype decision or they did it for the catalog so you could see that it was actually a Pleasant Company branded trunk. But yeah, they never, to my knowledge, produced any with the logo on the side. They were always on the top. So one of these days, I feel like I want to maybe find an old trunk that is being sold for parts and maybe modify one of my 1986 trunks to look like the catalog, because I think that would be so fun to have. We can also see here that we have black hangers in Molly's trunk, which was not how they were sold at the time. Molly's trunk originally came with silver hangers, and they didn't add black hangers to this version of the trunk until later in 1987, right before they changed the star pattern to the one that we all know, which, personally I think is a little less elegant and beautiful, but what are you going to do? They change stuff all the time. But again, Molly's trunk is one of my favorite things in my Molly collection because they're very hard to find, especially in good condition. The silver loves to rub off, so it's really, really difficult to find one with everything intact, including the original 3 hangers, plus the mirror that was glued on the back. So they're just very difficult to find, but it looks like we have Molly's original collection in here. I'm not entirely sure what this large, it almost looks black right here. It doesn't even look like it's her Christmas outfit, so I'm not exactly sure what it is. If I had to guess, it's probably her Christmas outfit, but very interesting. I don't exactly know what this is behind here because it's just so dark and grainy. Also, well, you'll note here that we have child size outfits. Again, it's been a couple of days since I recorded the first part of this video, so I can't remember if I talked about this. I guess I'll cut it out if I did already, but it was just incredible to me that Pleasant Rowland was already making child size outfits before the company even launched. I mean, when you think about what it takes to make children's clothes versus doll clothes, like I guarantee you the Goods was making these clothes in the very beginning, the people that made the dolls. I can almost guarantee you they were not making the children's size clothing. So this would have been completely different manufacturer and a whole set of problems to solve and things to package. And even just quickly, like looking over here, things like, we had the books. Each book had to have an author and be illustrated and published. And then the audiobooks, they had to find somebody to read the books out loud and then have somebody publish the tapes. It just was a lot to do. It's just incredible to me that even at this point in time, she was already thinking about child size outfits. It's incredible what she was able to accomplish. So again, we have Molly here in what is presumably either a prototype or the very first version of her pajamas. And they were, I swear I keep saying pajamas, I don't know why, but these were originally made with flannel, which is very interesting. They're I would say probably the hardest Molly outfit to find if you're including different versions. So her pajamas that are made out of flannel with the paper tag that shows that they were made in West Germany by Goods instead of China. This That's her rarest outfit to find. I can tell you, as someone who has aggressively collected Molly for years, this will be the thing that plagues you trying to complete an original 1986 Molly collection, is her pajamas. Those are her hardest outfit to find if you're trying to get the first version, because they were completely different and they were so much better. I have to say, they were a thick, cozy, warm flannel, like, that you could actually picture wearing. It's almost like a material like you picture baby blankets, at least from the 80s or 90s, being made out of. It's just a very completely different fabric, and like I said, in my opinion, much better. We have the original version of her bed here that coordinates with it as well. And interestingly, this pillow is made, maybe not this specific one, but the 1986 pillow is made out of the same flannel as her pajamas, and the stripes run horizontally. Actually, I think they ultimately changed them to go vertically to match the catalog, but the very original beds were made with the flannel pillow with the horizontal stripes, and the bedding and the bed were actually made with more of a flannel, like a solid red flannel material. Again, you would never be able to tell in this photo. And they very quickly changed it to corduroy. So all of the corduroy beds, like, those are the later versions, but to find, like, it's near impossible, but there is a flannel version of this bed that's really, really difficult to find. And I only have the bedding. I'm still looking for the frame. But yeah, just another one of those, like, Molly items that if you collect first versions, it will drive you absolutely insane. But this really was a sight to behold. I mean, it's still, like, even now I fantasize about being a child and getting ready for bedtime and putting on my doll's pajamas and then my matching pajamas and brushing her hair to get it ready for bed. Interestingly, here we actually see, I think for the first and maybe only time ever in a catalog, is seeing the like the little plastic barrettes that came with Molly's Christmas stocking. We actually see one in her hair in this catalog, and again, I don't think we have ever seen this from this point on. And funnily enough, they are just like human sized, like repurposed barrettes, so they're not to scale with Molly, obviously. Like the barrette is like whatever, like however big this is, but it's kind of funny that that's one of the things that actually isn't to scale. But yeah, I literally think this is the first and only time we ever see them in the catalog. But yeah, as I was saying, it's so fun to imagine, like, brushing your doll's hair, getting ready for bed, putting all her things away, and having sort of like a nighttime ritual with your doll, because she's such like a special presence in your life at that point. So yeah, like, well, it's weird, right? Like, this is nostalgic for me, even as someone who never had these dolls, but I can imagine, as someone that grew up with these things and actually had them, this must bring back such good memories. I hope, anyway. Oh, interestingly here, one thing before we move on, this does say here in the catalog, I'm curious when they changed this language, but it says, "Sporty but soft, Molly's bed has an upholstered headboard that matches the bedspread. Both are bright red flannel with candy stripe trim." So yeah, they were flannel. Like I said, I got the original bedding. It is flannel and not corduroy. So it is interesting that they actually note that in the catalog. Okay, moving on to the reader's corner, which I feel like most of us, I feel like if you're watching this video at this point, you're probably somebody that at least had these books growing up, because these were pretty accessible, I have to say. You didn't have to order these out of the catalog to get them. I think I got most of my Pleasant Company books from our local bookstore in my small town, as well as Sam's Club, which, if you're not familiar with Sam's Club, it's basically like a Costco. And so, I do think that many of us actually have very strong memories of these books and these stories. So this is probably the most nostalgic spread for me anyway, because I actually had basically everything in here except for this case and these audio cassettes, which are the books on tape, basically, that I'm currently trying to collect all of. But it's so fun to think about them setting all of these things up, because this was before the era of Photoshop being like very common, and you just like you shoot an image and then you say like, oh, we'll just edit that in post. It was very important for them at this point in time to get everything placed in just the right place. So because they weren't able to do much in post without spending a ton of money. So it's fun to like sit here and look. Like, they even used one of these keepsake bookcases as a riser here, and I can imagine like all of the tapes and props and things. Like, What do you bet they had like one of those plates? This seems like it would be such a pleasant rolling thing is to take one of those little display like easels or whatever you want to call them to display like a very special piece of china or something. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's holding these books up in the back here at least because you can't see the bottoms. But yeah, just all of the like prop dressing that would have had to go into making this spread as well. You know, it seems like it's a few books, but they really had to go in and make sure this bow looked perfect and all of that. So I just really appreciate all of the attention to detail here. And one of the most interesting things actually about this spread in particular, well, there's two actually. One, I believe we talked earlier about Molly's illustrations changing in her books. I mean, we have Samantha, Kirsten, and Molly's books. Let's see. I would assume that these are all like Meet Samantha, Meet Kirsten, and Meet Molly. But we have a version of Molly, like the original version of Meet Molly here, that actually pictures sort of an infamous dress in a way in the collector community because this was, look, we're on page 7 of Meet Molly and we see Molly in this really beautiful purple dress that Pleasant Company and American Girl never made. In the almost 40 years that Molly's been around, we have never seen this dress. And I don't know, I feel like I'm about to start a like change.org petition for American Girl to try and get them to make this dress and some other things because they wouldn't be costly to make, but they're just so entrenched in the history of Pleasant Company because they I believe did when they re-illustrated Meet Molly, they did this same illustration, I believe, and there is an updated version of this dress in the second version of Meet Molly with the new illustrations. So I just would love for them to go back and remake some of these outfits because it would make so many of us collectors so happy to actually expand our collection still and continue to work on them, you know, instead of like being, you know, trying to sell us her birthday outfit for the 1000th time in 40 years. But yeah, this is kind of one of the things I was talking about earlier with like illustration changes and stuff. But yeah, I really love this dress. I would love for them to maybe make this one day, maybe for the 40th anniversary. We'll see. But another like really interesting thing about this spread is we have the 9-book version of the Keepsake. What do they call this? I guess they just called it Keepsake Edition, and they want to call, what do you call this here? A slipcase. So the original slipcase for these books was meant to hold 9 books. And if you've been buying this stuff on eBay and kind of paying attention to it, you'll note that most of the ones you see hold 6 books. And that is because they reissued them basically when they added the 5th and 6th books in 1988. All of a sudden they had to like split everything up, right? So even in 1987, when they began publishing the Happy Birthday version of each of these stories, they, I guess, just sort of were like figuring out what to do. But by the time 1988 rolled around and they had the summer and winter stories added to their collections, they reduced the size of the slipcase down to hold only 6 books, and it was meant to hold all 6 books for each character that was available at the time. But the very original version that they designed in 1986 was this 9-book version that was meant to hold every story that they had published at the time. So we have Meet Kirsten, Meet Samantha, Meet Molly, Kirsten learns a lesson, Samantha learns a lesson, Molly learns a lesson, Kirsten surprise, Samantha surprise, and Molly surprise, which notably Kirsten is again getting first billing in the catalog because remember, she was the first doll that we looked at when we opened the catalog. I have a strong feeling that Kirsten was getting first billing because they were probably expecting Kirsten to be the best-selling doll. If I had to guess, I would say they thought Kirsten was going to be the bestseller. I mean, it was 1986, Barbie was all the rage, and if the Little Miss line by Mattel wasn't out, it was coming, but dolls really were, like, in this era, expected to be blue-eyed and blonde-haired, and I think that Kirsten was kind of like their safe character, if I had to guess, because she was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and she had kind of that prairie story, you know. And certainly growing up in the South, that aesthetic was really big, and I'm not checking my dates here, but I would assume that things like Little House on the Prairie was on TV at this point, so that was a really big thing at the time. I feel like Anne of Green Gables was really big as well, so I bet you they assumed that Kirsten was going to be the doll that just absolutely carried this company, and it's so funny that it ended up being Samantha, but it's just that's the thing, you never really know what's going to happen when you launch a company, which is, again, it's just so insane that she started this company with $1 million of her own money. Just absolutely crazy. So this 6 book or the 9 book set here is one of the hardest things to find when it comes to like just buying like paper paraphernalia from these catalogs, because they quickly switched this. They, by the time this came around in 1988, this had really only been on the market for a little, probably not even 2 years. So yeah, and what's thing is just so crazy looking at this right here. This original the keepsake edition with 9 hardcover books was $125 in 1986. That is mind blowing, because by the time you paid for shipping, which there really, I don't think was much of a thing of free shipping in this era, by the time you account for inflation, the shipping that you would have to pay, if you just ordered this, you were paying almost $400 for 9 children's books. And again, these are books, like I said, you could go in Sam's Club and buy these books. It's not that they were like a special edition or anything. These were the same version that you could buy in bookstores. But this one little case right here, they're not signed or anything, but this one little slipcase with this little metal bookmark made this set cost $125. That is absolutely mind blowing to me. And I have to say that's probably why it's so rare. Who is spending that much money? Like, a book set is like twice as much as a doll at this point. I mean, if we flip back here, how much was Molly? The cheapest version of Molly was $68. It is so crazy to me that this entire doll and all her accessories, her, like, in every part that brings her together, her box, her packaging, her pamphlet, and it came with a paperback book as well. You already got one of the 9 books. $68, which would have put that at what, 136 if you double it. You're paying twice the cost of an actual doll with a book to buy this hardback set. Absolutely mind-blowing. And I have to say, that's my guess as to why it is so hard to find these, because you just needed to be burning money to feel like this was a justifiable cost. That is so Lucille Bluth to me. Like, sometimes I picture Pleasant Rowland being Lucille Bluth, and that she's like, how much could a book cost? $125? So I feel like that's what's going on here. I would be interested to flip through later catalogs and see if they got this price down. I imagine that they did, but $125 is actual robbery, and that is so crazy. I love it. It's so unhinged, and I love mine. I have both the hardback and the keepsake edition with the 9 paperback books as well. And I'll tell you, I think, I did pay about retail. I have to say, I think I paid a little bit more than the original retail for the hardback version, but the keepsake set, I paid a little over $100, I think, for, but they're just so hard to find. I feel like the paperback version is even harder to find, because if you were gonna go ahead and spend this much money, you might as well spend $125 and get the hardback books. But this to me must live in infamy, like charging this much for 9 children's books. But regardless, I love this. This is such a vibe. They obviously continued the same aesthetic that they had through the whole catalog, with the parchment paper and the whitewashed wood floor. Just so special. And you'd want it to be for $125. So this here is actually one of my absolute favorite spreads that they have ever done, because this is, in terms of the dolls, we're obviously not talking about books and extra paraphernalia, but this is everything that they made in the first year. So we have the dolls, their trunks, their beds, which was the only furniture that they had at the time. The school desks didn't come, I think, until 89 or 90. It might have been 1990. But we have their school collection and Christmas collection for each doll. And this is basically the 80-90% of what Pleasant spent those couple of years working on. Like, this is like actually my favorite photo of this. If you pan back, they actually took a version of this photo with Pleasant Rowland like sitting down, and pajama party position, basically, like showing off her work. Like it's literally like, I'll put it up on the screen, but it's basically like she's at the local like county fair and she's showing off her prize pig, and like, boy, was this pig a prize. But yeah, this is all of her hard work all in one place. I just think it's just such a beautiful sight to behold. And I often will come back here and reference this page sometimes just to like use it as motivation, because this is really the core of my collecting goals as well, is trying to collect every single thing on this page, like first edition, mint condition with the original packaging and everything. So I really love to come back to this and always, again, just remember what I'm truly after. But again, you can see here, interestingly, we had a couple different prototypes of Molly's trunk, because the emblem is actually where it ultimately ended up being, on the top of the trunk here, even though we still have the black hangers. This is interesting here that it's not on the side. So I don't know if these were just temporarily glued on here or what, but it's very interesting that we had two different versions of this trunk in this catalog. And you can see here, I don't think this is the original mirror. It looks larger than what they ultimately shipped in 1986. I'm looking at mine now, actually, because it's in this room. But I think this is actually a little bit larger. And interestingly, Samantha's emblem is still on the side here, because ultimately they ended up putting it on the front and it wouldn't be visible. But in this picture, you can see this on the top. So very, very interesting, I think. One of the things you can see here, I know we kind of probably mentioned it earlier in Kirsten's bedtime spread, like her Pleasant Dreams Kirsten spread, but you can really see here all of the extra brushwork on her trunk, like so many extra details on this, which is why I love my 1986 trunk so much, because it really does look handmade and hand painted. And you can just see, they obviously had to cut down the amount of labor that went into these, because it was just, that's so much work to put into like hand making a child's toy. And to keep their costs down, I'm sure they had to cut back on the amount of brush strokes that the artisans had to do when they were painting these things. But I just really love looking through all of this and just seeing basically the collection that started it all and created a nationwide phenomenon of, young kids that just absolutely went feral for these dolls in their collections for, almost 40 years now. It's real interesting. I did not get a good deal on this catalog. I paid quite a bit of money for it. I can't remember exactly how much, but we're talking probably three figures if I had to guess. And it kind of sucks. The seller did not disclose that there was actually some writing here. This is the only writing that we've seen in here, I believe. But obviously this little kid came in here and they were like, you know what? At this point, like, why? It's funny that they were like trying to pretend like they were being good and only ordering a few things, but be so for real. Like, just check. At this point, just check every box. I mean, come on. But it is interesting. The collections actually do cost, they are different prices depending on which character you order, which obviously would come down to the manufacturing costs, which, who was the most expensive? Samantha, which is, I guess, is no surprise. Samantha was the most expensive to make. And I'm actually not sure why, because to look at them, I would think Kirsten would be the most expensive, but she's actually 25 bucks cheaper. But it's hard to see why, honestly, especially because of these trunks. Maybe this trunk was more expensive to put together, but I'm looking at, like, I don't know. I don't know enough about manufacturing of these types of things. So I don't know. It's very interesting that they all cost different. I mean, these days, like American Girl, if this was the case with American Girl these days, I mean, they would say, okay, Samantha's the most expensive to make, so all of these will cost $475. But it's interesting that the one that was supposed to be saving money for the war actually did end up being the cheapest. But yeah, so fun. All of these little details in here. And they have the little toy soldier version of her snow globe, which it was actually randomized in 1986. So there was a snow globe that had, there was the toy soldier one that we see in the catalog, but they also had a Santa Claus version, which I also have. And then there was, or do I think maybe I have the snowman version. There's a toy soldier, a snowman, and Santa Claus. And so there's three different versions from 1986. And I have two of them. I want to say maybe it is the snowman I have. I can't remember. But I also have the toy soldier, which I spent a fortune on trying to buy. I basically had to buy Molly's original collection complete just to get this snow globe, because I've been looking for it for so long. But yeah, really just a full spread of treasures here. All right, I'm going to quickly turn the page and cover up the address on the back so I don't have to do a bunch of extra editing in post to cover up the person's address. So let me get this flipped over to the back and we will close with our final thoughts. So here we have a message to parents, which is something that Pleasant Rowland did not only in this first catalog, but ultimately ended up doing, I think, through her entire tenure at Pleasant Company, there was always a letter to the parents, and sometimes it would be typed up and shipped with the dolls, and often you would see it in the catalog as well. So again, I remember like when the Girl of Today was announced in 1995. I remember that she also did a message to parents talking about, her inspiration and motivation, why she was making these things. It's very, very touching. And you can really see how much love and care and thought she put into everything she did. It just is so incredibly respectful. I have the utmost respect for Pleasant Rowland and what she has given the world, and that, what she's done for my life and so many other people who have really been able to dive into this world and find something that really just helps you escape. And this, even to this day, like, I'm transported back into the late 80s and early 90s, just flipping through the catalogs and appreciating all of the hard work and attention to detail, and just how she very clearly would not accept no for an answer. If she saw a challenge, she saw that as an obstacle that she was going to overcome and make things happen. And it really is just a true testament to her hard work and vision. I just have nothing but love and admiration for this company, very clearly, because I've basically made it my entire personality at this point. But every time I flip through these catalogs, I just get a feeling that I can't get anywhere else, and I know so many of you feel the same. So thank you so much for spending this time with me and hopping back and taking a little trip on the old horse and buggy down memory lane. All right, I think that's going to do it for today. I hope you had fun, and I also want to say thank you so much to the supporters on Patreon that helped make this channel possible in the first place. If you want to chip in, you can check out the link in the description. You'll get hours and hours of extra American Girl content that you can't watch anywhere else, so I would love it if you would check it out. You can also check out my merch and my shop at idreamofjohnny.com, and yeah, if you want to just keep hanging out and watching videos, I've got some like this one right here that YouTube thinks you might like. And yeah, I hope to see you there. Later.